Good morning. Very nice to see you all. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dimitris Anassis. I'm a partner at Dickinson at the Piraeus office, and I'm very privileged to be joined by very distinguished panelists this morning discussing a very important issue, which is transparency in emissions. Just to briefly introduce the panelists, I'm joined by Stamatis Fradelos, who's a Vice President on Regulatory Affairs at ABS, the Classification Society. I'm joined by Vassilios Maroulis, who's the Managing Director and Global Industry Head on Shipping, Logistics and Offshore at Citi. I'm joined by Ms. Plakantonakis, who is a Chief Strategy Officer at Starbulk, and Angelos Vatikalos, who's the Director of Strategic Business Development and Planning at Signal Maritime. Just by way of a very brief introduction before I give the panelists a chance to very briefly introduce themselves and let us have their own very brief views on transparency. What we do know is that shipowners have a responsibility in terms of emissions reporting to a number of stakeholders, whether that be financiers, their charterers, regulators, classification societies, and so on. At the same time, there are a number of measures and regulations worldwide that have been imposed in terms of emissions reporting with which the owners and a number of other stakeholders have to comply with. So I'd like to start by giving each of the panelists a few minutes, just a couple of minutes, to let us know what they understand transparency in emissions to mean and to involve. Mr. Fradelos.
Kalimera, good morning to everyone. Thank you, Dimitri. So briefly, and I'm going to provide mainly the class perspective on this. Of course, transparency is about measuring, reporting the emissions, and the data to be available to other parties. For us, and what we see as a need is also to reach in a high level of granularity as well. This is important because, of course, we need transparency, but also we need to have the data in a detail that will enable us to provide answers. And we see now this need as we have started working on improving the CII. And it is obvious that we need this high level of granularity and transparency in order to use the data and to be able to provide solutions, proposals for a more efficient and fair framework. So we have seen this need several years ago, before the implementation of MRV and the DCS, where our clients were looking for benchmarking data, because at that time there was no information available. Now, of course, mainly from Thetis and MRV, there is a source of information that can be used, and we see a quite, significant level of transparency, but still we have more work to do in this field. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Maroulis, coming from a financier, how do you perceive transparency in emissions?
Good morning, everyone, first of all. Pleasure to be here. You are what you measure. Increasingly, there is regulatory scrutiny for all the corresponding shipping portfolios. Each and every financier will, of course, proceed down its own path based on where they're based, what their regulator needs. For the time being, of course, there is a consensus with regards to Poseidon principles both in terms of trajectory and ultimately how we measure. And there is, it's a very broad range of financial institutions. I do sincerely believe that increasingly we will be shifting to a notional CO2 figure. And therefore no efficiency metrics, but rather what are our corresponding portfolios emitting, and what is it that we want with regards to the targets that we will be pursuing. For us, honesty and transparency with regards to our clients is of utmost importance. We are totally transparent in terms of how we use the data and what we do with it. And ultimately, the data is something that belongs to the owners. So we treat it with extreme care, and we do not disclose it to any other party except for our regulators, which is ultimately something that we need to do. So it's an extremely important element, transparency. It is a journey, and therefore we are in this journey together. And I think increasingly all of these things will play a very significant role. But again, I think the most important element is we are what we measure. We need to measure to be able to meet the corresponding targets, whatever they are.
Thank you, Mr. Maroulis. It's very interesting. We're very blessed with a very varied panel here today. We've got an owner, we've got a technology provider, we've got a financier, and we've got a classification society. And it's very interesting what you say in the sense that there might be, in the future, a notional sense of emissions rather than actual metrics. I find that extremely interesting. And I'd be interested to hear what the owners have to say about that. So, Ms. Plakantonakis.
Thank you, Dimitris, and thank you, Nicholas, Olga, the Capital Link team, for inviting me here today. So, to your question, Dimitris, allow me to set the scene a bit on what transparency with regards to emissions data means for a ship owner, and this is not a new concept. Since 2019, shipowners have been reporting their fuel oil consumption in the DCS system of the IMO, and actually this is the system through which the data were used in 2023 to estimate, to calculate the carbon intensity indicator of our ships. Since 2015, we're also reporting through the MRV to European authorities the emissions of the vessels that call European ports. In 2023, we also reported the EEXI of our vessels on the technical front, and for a few years now, we're already working with RightShip to report the greenhouse gas rating of our vessels, which again is a technical indicator. So both on the operational indicators and on the technical indicators, there has been transparency in the market, which is mandatory, and it is driven by regulators. Now, at the same time, we have initiatives like the Poseidon Principles by the banks. We have the Sea Cargo Charter by charterers. We have Poseidon Principles for marine insurance. These are voluntary initiatives which are driven by our counterparties. And we do participate in these initiatives in order to enable our counterparties to report on the climate alignment of their portfolios and of their activities. So along with the regulatory, we also have voluntary reporting in terms of working together with our stakeholders. And then, of course, there are things a ship-owning company can do in order to take it to the next step and go beyond regulatory compliance and beyond compliance with our constituents' requirements. And what do these initiatives entail? For example, Carbon Disclosure Project. This is an initiative that is it's a very demanding framework. We have been participating since 2021, and it is a rating which enables us to assess our environmental performance and to identify areas for improvement, which educates us and help us get better. We have our ESG report that we publish every year, and where we have a very detailed report of all our emissions, of related indicators to our emissions, actions, strategies, plans in order to improve on those. Actually, our new report is coming out within this month, so watch out for that. What is new in this report and is related, again, with emissions is that this year, for the first time, and I think we're one of the first shipping companies globally to do that, we are also reporting Scope 3 emissions, along with our Scope 1 and Scope 2, which basically refer to emissions that are derived not from assets owned or controlled by us, but through our value chain. So Again, we have regulatory requirements, we have voluntary initiatives, and we have company-specific initiatives that take us a step further. Now, where does its shipping company stand in terms of all these transparency reporting requirements? This is a matter of strategic decision. So where do you want to position yourself? Do you simply want to comply, or do you want to go the extra mile and provide additional data, work together with your stakeholders, and be prepared for the future, which will require additional transparency? And in that respect, we have decided as a company since some time now to be the latter, so to be as transparent as possible, which has both benefits and risks and costs, which I'm sure we will elaborate further in the duration of our panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now going back to another important stakeholder, a technology provider. Sigla is one of the leading ones in this market. And I'd like to ask Angelos Vatikalos what his preliminary views are.
Good morning, kalimera to all. Thank you, Dimitri. I think it's great to be part of such a diverse panel today. Hopefully a very insightful discussion. As you correctly said, I'm the technology provider in the panel. At the same time, I'm working for Signal Maritime, which is the commercial operator. We manage tanker pools, so I'll try to be a hybrid, let's say, between technology and commercial operator. So I think transparency, as you mentioned, is the basis for any emission scheme. From a technology provider perspective, I think transparency is simply for all stakeholders in the industry, for all market players, to be able to have access to accurate and reliable data. From a commercial operator perspective, it's a bit different, let's say, end-to-end the story, meaning being able to receive data from your partners, meaning the owners that have trusted vessels to you for management, being able to analyze them, to store them, of course, in voyage management systems, analyze, calculate the emissions, provide the emissions to clients, our charterers, and of course, participating in initiatives such as the Sea Cargo Charter Initiative, and being compared with others and best players, lower emitters, if you will, and close the feedback back to your partners by reporting how good you're doing on that front. But just to sum it up, I think transparency today is somehow a fact, meaning someone can look also the airline industry, what happened in the airline industry years before, meaning all the components are there. We have AIS data for vessels, we have the technical characteristics of vessels, we have the commercial information for each vessel. So in reality, you just need something to put everything together, bring everything together, and this is basically technology. So you can analyze, extract value, outcomes and insights out of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now let's try to break it down just a little more and see where that gets us. Starting with Ms. Plakantonakis, the owners aspect. I'd be grateful if you could just let us know briefly what you perceive the benefits of transparency in emissions to be, and the related challenges at the same time.
Thank you, Dimitri. So as I already touched upon, we do consider transparency and accurate monitoring and reporting of our emissions data to be an indispensable part of our decarbonization strategy. I don't think we can be talking today about decarbonization in our industry in the absence of transparency. Regulators need data in order to form regulations, strategies, measures. Companies need data in order to demonstrate compliance. There's a lot of discussion around collaboration, which is, again, very important in order to accelerate decarbonization, and how can you collaborate with your counterparties if you do not share data. So we see this as a competitive advantage, not as a necessary evil, which is sometimes being discussed. Now, why is that? For starters, for us being transparent, this creates a discipline in our organization. In order to report and monitor emissions data, we get into the detail of what we do, we report it, and this pushes the organization in order to improve continuously. And of course, it is a sign of good governance. We're a publicly listed company. It is important for our investors, but of course also for our banks, for our charterers, but also for our own people in the office. They take pride in the fact that we are transparent. Transparency builds trust, demonstrates commitment. So these are on the benefits front, along also, of course, with the fact that we learn also from these initiatives, and they enable us to take joint action with our stakeholders. So, for example, with our financial institutions, we have been able to engage in sustainability-linked facilities, whereby we have annual margin adjustments which are linked to the carbon intensity of our fleet. Then we continuously learn through these frameworks, and I can make this practical. For example, through our participation in the Carbon Disclosure Project, it became evident that we would need an ESG committee at the board level, which will further provide guidance to our ESG strategies and monitoring of performance, which we have implemented since last year. Through our participation in ESG reports and through the new GRI standards, it became clear that we had to update, to enhance our code of conduct, to strengthen policies related, for example, to anti-slavery, anti-harassment. So this is a learning process for us, a continuous improvement process, and we leverage this transparency in order to take joint action and, of course, to become better. Now, Mr. Papadimitriou mentioned in his speech earlier that there's no such thing as a free lunch. Of course, this comes at a cost for the company. We need a lot of investment in people, in processes and systems. We have a vessel performance monitoring team in the office which continuously monitors the performance of our vessels. They have developed systems which include validation and control points to minimize data entry errors by our crews. We have invested heavily in telemetry in order to further ensure the timeliness and accuracy of our vessel data. And of course, we have people in the office who work to coordinate all our reporting projects, for example, CDP submissions, ESG reports. We work with ESG rating indices agencies across the world, like Sustainalytics, for example, in order to further provide data and transparency of what we do and our ways of working when it comes to emissions. Now, there are also risks. So there may be years where we report a performance which is worse than last year. And this is what happened for us last year, for example. In 2022, we reported in our ESG report data from 2021, whereby the total carbon footprint of our fleet had increased, and the carbon intensity of our fleet had deteriorated. Now, this data can be misleading if read standalone, and it's very important for us as a company to communicate and to explain clearly what the data means and what's the story behind these numbers. And why had that happened? We had increased the size of our fleet, the owned fleet, therefore our carbon footprint had increased, and because of the good market in 2021, our charterers were demanding higher speeds, which had led to a deterioration in our carbon intensity indicators. So here there's a perception risk that your stakeholders, your constituents, may read the numbers in a wrong way. Therefore, it is very important, along with the investment in your people, processes, systems, to be alert when it comes to stakeholder engagement and management and very clear communication. So yes, benefits, costs and risks at the same time. We are confident that this is the right way to go about it. We believe that transparency will increase as we get closer to a global carbon taxation scheme, and as soon as there is a price behind emissions. And of course, the use of technology that Angelos mentioned will enable this transparency and will further accelerate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go back and ask Mr. Fradelos what his views are on something that Mr. Maroulis said about the potential move to a notional aspect in terms of emissions. As Ms. Plakantonakis said, metrics are becoming more advanced, and no doubt we'll be elaborating on that with Mr. Vatikalos a bit later. So, going back to something that Mr. Dimitris also said, moving from the commonplace to common sense. Mr. Fradelos, do you agree, basically? Do you agree, given classification societies, the burden that falls on classification societies to safeguard emissions and their transparency in terms of calculating? Do you agree that as metrics become more advanced, there is a chance that we might be going towards a notional model as opposed to a heavily advanced metrics model?
Yes, actually there are two sides here on addressing the metrics, because of course from one side we need to have something simple, and this was the main effort from IMO, what we have seen the previous year, because the discussions on metric and introducing a metric to shipping was starting back in 2010 and 11. And there were a lot of papers and discussions about metrics. We have seen different proposals, but actually what we have seen from IMO side was to introduce a simple one, something that can be based on simple data and considering that we need to verify this data. So a complicated metrics which will actually need the submission on detailed data from different side of operation of the vessel will not be easy to be verified. And this is an important element we need to keep in mind when we're discussing about data and metrics is we need to ensure a level playing field. We need to make sure that operators submit the data and we have the capability to verify this data with high level of confidence to ensure this level playing field. So now, of course, we understand that this simplicity has created some problems because the metric we are using, I'm sure you are all aware, it's somehow penalizing some type of ships. It's not fair for depending your operation, and this is something, of course, that has been recognized from IMO, and this is why we have, this open invitation, and we are working, I'm sure, we are working with different stakeholders, shipowners, and other organizations to provide feedback to regulators about how we can improve the metric. So there is ongoing work, and we think at the end we will have a fair scheme, and of course at that time we will possibly see a more robust implementation. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you very much. I'd like to go to, and I'd like, with your permission, to read out just a very short quote that I read on Tradewinds some time ago, and it goes like this. No matter how many existing initiatives are here in terms of sustainability, if the charterers are not willing to pay a premium for future-oriented ships, none of these initiatives make any real difference except to pay lip service to the green credentials of such charterers. And that's a very obviously provocative statement here. Unfortunately, because of an emergency, we don't have a charterer on the panel, so I could grill them on this very point. But as Mr. Dimitris said, what Mrs. Lagarde said is true. At the end of the day, someone's going to pay for it. And is it the case, one wonders, that the end consumer is going to have to pay for all these initiatives to materialize? Now, how is that related to transparency in emissions, one may ask? Well, first of all, let's start with whether, and I'm going to ask Mr. Maroulis about that, in terms of the financier's perspective, because perception is reality, and I'd like to ask him, is there transparency in emissions at the moment? And if and to the extent that the position could be improved, what do you think that would assist with that?
Well, so let me start with a point. I do believe that increasingly, very, very slow steps, we are seeing charterers and cargo providers, not on the oil tanker or dry bulk space yet, but on the container side, willing to pay significant premium in order for their boxes to be carried on the latest technology vessels of the corresponding fleet, including in some occasions very specifically dual fuel vessels. So as and when green fuels are available for their cargo to be transported on those sort of ships. So that has happened very recently, and it's actually something that is important to note, because Scope 3 emissions and the corresponding commitments of the corresponding charterers is what is going to drive ultimately where I think the shipping industry will go. And therefore, very large entities, and I do believe that it's going to happen first on the container side, because those corresponding entities have made the commitments. They need to reduce as much as possible the emissions from their supply chain, and therefore we are seeing the first movement, if you wish, on that side. I think with regards to transparency, I do believe there is transparency, at least with regards to. Now, I am looking at it from a financier's point of view, right? So, therefore, I expect my clients to be fully transparent with me as I am fully transparent with them. What is it that I can do? How can I assist? And therefore, if that transparency isn't there, then effectively it's quite easy. Then effectively they won't be clients any further. Or if the transparency is of a different, ultimately, quality that we require, then again it's going to be exactly the same outcome. Why? Because banking is a heavily regulated industry. Our regulators require very specific elements and very specific data requirements. And there is no, I'm sorry, but XYZ client just didn't provide what we needed in order for us to report what you require, whether that's the OCC or the Fed with regards to us being a US institution. So therefore, I do sincerely believe, and that's why I am extremely optimistic, and I think it is important to take a moment and reflect. I think this industry is doing, and it is something that is being observed, it is doing everything that it can in order and it is at the forefront of ultimately actions that can be taken. At the same point in time, there are very specific, very important bottlenecks, which ultimately, even if a ship owner tomorrow builds just a methanol vessel in order for there is no green methanol. So there are fundamental elements that need to be overcome, but I am cautiously optimistic with regards to everything that I'm seeing in terms of what our clients are doing, what their competition is also doing, and also increasingly confident that as a result of the Sea Cargo Charter, the commitments of the charterers, we are seeing some change. It is slow, and I'm not going to say that it's going to happen very quickly, nor that there is a question mark with regards to, of course, tanker and dry bulk space.
Thank you very much. I think you have very aptly described what I call the domino effect, and that is that potentially even starting with the financiers, there is an almost linear sense of conformity and compliance, so that the financier, for example, demands that the owner or the charter of the operator, depending on the type of finance, comply, and that just moves on down the chain. And you're right, and from our experience in advising even oil majors in terms of drafting clauses in relating to sustainability, it's the oil majors, it's the major operators that first ask for stringent conditions to be imposed on them, because they also have to comply. So it's exactly what you described. So I would agree with you, for what it's worth, in being very, as you said, cautiously optimistic. I think that would be justified. Now, going back to technology, since we have a very distinguished technology provider, and that's your other hat there, Mr. Vatikalos. Could you let us know what you know in terms of standardization and innovation, which I believe are the two keys in terms of the involvement of technology? How does innovation and standardization fit in all of this?
Thank you, Dimitri. Yeah, it's actually a great question and a tricky one, but I'll try to answer it. Meaning, I think, first of all, unfortunately, I cannot show you live how technology works on this, so I'll try to bring a few real examples, hopefully. The first has to do with the technology platforms and how we use it towards this direction, I mean emissions transparency. I'll talk about Signal Ocean platform, and especially how we utilize data, like, as I mentioned before, AIS, commercial data, technical characteristics of vessels to calculate emissions at vessel level or fleet level, whether this has to do with CII, OA, or other metrics. An interesting case, just to make it a bit more real, has to do with sea cargo charter. Signal Maritime, that I represent, is a member of sea cargo charter. So in the first report last year, referring to 2021 data for emissions for 25 participants, if I'm not mistaken, we did the following experiment, let's say comparison. We used the report in order to see the actuals, the reported figures of emissions, and at the same time, we ran in the platform, in our Signal Ocean platform, the same, let's say, ranking of participants in terms of alignment towards the target, the trajectory for the year. And the result was quite impressive, I think, in two ways. First of all, we managed to match the exact sequence of ranking in terms of participants. So the best, the lowest, let's say, emitter in sea cargo charter public report was exactly the same in the platform, etc., etc. The second, etc. The second part, the second thing of comparison was the emission figure, the emission figures themselves. Meaning the lump sum amounts of emissions and the EOI of its fleet. There, of course, we had some deviation from 3 to 7–8%, but I think I find it pragmatic and fair because, as I mentioned before, we're talking about estimates. And here I think it's quite important to highlight that we are talking about a system that, or any other systems, I'm just speaking on behalf of Signal now, but of course there are other systems as well. We're talking about a system that has no manual intervention and generated this ranking in a matter of seconds, and it's a fully automated end-to-end system. So this is, I think, one of some simple examples of how technology plays a key role in transparency.
Thank you very much. Now, since we managed to go through all our time, I'd like to look at the future. Now, the particular Greek shipping is always stated to be a very traditional and very resistant industry in terms of change. This is something that goes contrary against the what seems to be a worldwide effort to, in my view, very violently make shipping comply. Indeed, this is a statistic that you will have heard before. Shipping is responsible for less than 3% of global emissions, yet it's responsible for over 85% of global transport. And that inevitably gets us to the future. And I'd like to ask Ms. Plakantonakis from owners what her views are in terms of the incentives that Greek owners would need in terms of increasing, get further, their efforts towards standardization, innovation, and overall transparency in emissions.
Thank you, Dimitri. So I will be very brief. I see we only have less than 4 minutes. In order to take a view on the future, one needs to see the regulations ahead of us. We have the IMO taking a more ambitious stance towards 2050. We have intermediate targets in 2030, 2040. We have a commitment for a global tax on carbon coming into force in 2027. I cannot stress enough how this will accelerate developments. Once there is a price on carbon, then a lot of investments on new technologies, new fuels will make financial sense for ship owners, for charterers, for the entire value chain. You mentioned incentives, standardization, digitalization. We do see standardization. A recent example is Citi, for example. They did align their greenhouse gas rating with the EEXI formula, and we expect to see more of that coming into the picture in the coming years. We do see digitalization enabling the reporting, the monitoring, and thereafter the reporting of emissions data, as Angelos has very rightly said. And we do see, very importantly, a lot of collaboration. Every month there's a new center, there's a new forum being announced. Green corridors or these initiatives in the market are great because they enable the exchange of data across the value chain. They enable acceleration of all these efforts. So to sum up, regulatory ambition, digitalization, standardization, collaboration, this is the future that we see ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's absolutely right. Just as a closing comment, since we've effectively run out of time, I'd like to make one of the points that we discussed with Mr. Walker, who unfortunately can't make it today. And it's quite interesting because he's a managing director of Vitera Chartering, a major charterer. And what we very much agreed on is that all this effort towards compliance in terms of sustainability points towards leaving aside the inevitability of it. It only points towards collaboration. Metrics like CII and other indicators, it doesn't matter whether they're accurately calculated or even properly devised. I would probably say that most people's view is that collaboration is key. All the stakeholders involved, starting from owners, charters, financiers, regulators, classification societies, and so on, they all need to see this as an opportunity. Clauses like CII that we deal with every day sometimes only act to enhance the polarization involved, and that is something we do not want. Hopefully you have found this discussion to be constructive. Do catch us around and ask us questions. I've had the privilege of being in this panel. I've also had the privilege of not having to really answer any questions. But thankfully, my fellow panelists have given very good answers, and thank you very much.